In this video, we're going to be talking about creating users and storing their passwords. The first thing we need to do, go to our package.swift and add yet another dependency. Once again, it's going to come straight from Vapor. This one is going to be called auth. So we're going to get auth.get, and this time it's going to come from 2.0.0-rc. Once we've added this, let's go back to our terminal and let's regenerate our project. This might take a moment, so feel free to come back. Now that we've gotten it installed, our next step is to actually configure it. Let's go into our sources, app, configure, and at the very top, we're going to import authentication. One step we actually need to go back and do, you might remember that when we add a new package, we also have to add it as a target. We have to go and just quickly regenerate this, and we'll find that we'll be able to use authentication. I like to close my Xcode project every time I'm regenerate a new project. That way I have like a new fresh copy of it and Xcode hasn't persisted anything. Now that we're back, let's go back to configure.swift. So now that we've imported authentication, just like we had done before with Fluent, SQLite Provider, and Leaf Provider, we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to register a new service, and this one is called the Authentication Provider. Now that this is done, let's go to our model. We're going to go to our user model, and we're going to add a password. Let's fill out the rest of this. So self.password is equal to password. So now that we have this done, let's go to our controller. You may remember that we've created some routes for the index, create, and show. Now, if we think about the information that's being sent in, it should look a little bit different. So we'll send this as our password. But one of the things we need to realize is that this needs to change. When we grab a user, we want to not actually save this password. That's unsafe. And a lot of times hackers can get into our site, get into our database, and get a user's password. Now what we want to do is encrypt a user's password. And the way we're going to do that is using something called bcrypt. So what we're going to do first is create an instance of the hasher. We're going to create a bcrypt hasher. And this hasher is going to take the password that we've sent in and basically change it and encrypt and make it a much longer, complicated string such that we don't ever have access to the original password and a hacker can't get access to it. So what we're going to do now is reset password. We're going to make a new password using the old password, and we're going to do exactly what we did before in save. Let's run this and try this out. We have one small bug we need to fix. Let's go back to the user and let's add in password string. Let's rerun it. And once it's started to run, it should give us a few messages here. One thing that I have not mentioned, now that we've changed the structure of our user model, you should have gone into your project and deleted your database. One small gotcha. Let's now go to Postman. We're going to send a post, and we're just going to write Amelia, and we're going to write Vapor Rocks. So let's send it to /users, and let's hit send. And we notice we've gotten a username, and we've gotten a password. Now this is the hashed version of the password that will be stored in our database. Now we don't want to actually expose this. This is something that should be only used internally, and even the user or even anyone using our API should not even have access to this. So let's go and figure out a way we can hide this. So let's go back to Xcode, and we're going to go into the user.swift. So now that we're here, we're going to define a class within our class. Now that might seem strange to you, but it's actually quite common in Swift. So we're going to define a final class, and we're going to call this public user. It's going to be very, very similar with a notable exception. It's not going to have the password. It's still going to have an init, so very, very similar. It's still going to conform to the same protocols that we had set below. So let's go ahead and do this. Now notice that it's scoped under user, so it's slightly a little bit different. One of the details here is that this public user, all it's going to be is almost like a subset of our original user. It's going to be coming from the same exact table, so we need to indicate that. So in our SQLite model, we're going to just tell it to use the user entity. This is going to ensure that we're using the same exact database table. Let's also go ahead and add the other extensions. So user, public user, conforming to parameter. And in this case, we don't actually need any migrations. All we want to do is set it so that basically Fluent is aware that the default database for our public user is going to be SQLite. Since it's going to be using the same table, we don't actually have to add in migration. So let's go to the bottom by our other migrations, and let's just set user, public user, dot default database is equal to SQLite. Now that we've done this, let's go back to our controller for a second. We're going to have to change some of the things we had before. You might remember that we have this user parameter and this show. So let's now change this to our user dot public user and our user. Let's do it again. And so now let's go through. So first things first, we're not going to get back future users because we don't want a situation where we're getting back people's passwords. So let's do this again. Public user, and we're going to let query work on the public user. Now remember, it has the same exact things as the user, conforms to the same protocols, and it also uses the same table. So we know this information is going to be correct. Let's skip this one for now. We'll come back. Let's do the same thing here. Public user, and one more time. Let's go see if it works. So let's try users 1. Let's hit it. So one quick thing, let's of course rerun it. Let's give this a second. Let's try it again. There we can see immediately that the password isn't there. It's exactly what we wanted. Let's go back to Xcode. So we have something interesting here. First off, if we remember from earlier scenarios with these routes, we had this scenario where when we got some information back, like so, we were able to convert it to something else. Now that's what we want to do. We want to take our user, so we're going to do the same thing we did before. So this time, are we going to decode a user? So yes, we are. But this time, we're going to flat map. We're going to flat map, and we're actually going to change this into a user, public user, dot self. So now I'm just going to return this. And this user in here is an instance of our user object, which makes sense. Now what we need to be able to do is do all the stuff we had before. So setting the password makes sense. And we're still going to save on the request. But this time, what we need to do is to turn this into a public user. One other small change to make, public user. So we're returning this future public user. And so now all we need to do is actually create a public user. So why don't we go back to our user model, and all I'm going to do is write an init in here. I'm going to pass in a user, and all I'm going to do is set some of its information. So we're going to set it, the user ID, and we're going to set the username. What this is going to do for us is allow us to initialize a public user using a user, and then hide our password. One thing we can do here, let's do user.username. The ID is optional, so let's properly unwrap. So now we have the ID. Let's set self.id is equal to ID. Now let's go back to our user controller, and we have this user.save. So what we're going to do now is create a public user, and we're going to initialize it using our user. Now that we have this public user, remember that we said that we would return a future user. So let's do that. So we're going to return future, and let's pass in our public user. Now let's get rid of this, and let's recap. So our create route, it's going to take in a request. It's eventually going to give us a future public user to hide that password. We're going to decode the user that's being sent, so getting in username and password. We're going to tell it that eventually it's going to become a user public user. So we're going to flat map to convert it from one type to the next. We're going to hash the password. So basically, creating an instance of the hasher using bcrypt. That is the algorithm that will help us encrypt the password or hash it. We're then going to reset the password by hashing the original password. We're going to save. And then finally, we're going to just create an instance of the public user so that we can return it without the password. So let's go and try this. So let's send a post. Let's send some information. Let's add Johan. Let's add I love vapor. And let's send it. Also, don't forget to rerun. Let's fix our post, users. And there we have it. We've created a user. We just get back the username. There isn't any password being shown. That's what we expected.